OK, we're joined now by the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, Josh Frydenberg from Canberra. Thanks for joining us, Josh.
Nice to be with you, Chris.
Look, I want to ask you firstly about Professor Gillian Triggs. What is going on here when you have the President of the Human Rights Commission meeting under a Labor government, twice meeting with Labor immigration ministers to tell them that she wants to have, in fact, that she's going to have an inquiry into children in detention, but she's going to delay it till after the election? That is inappropriate, isn't it?
Well, Chris, the greatest victims of Labor's failed border protection policy were those 8,000 children who were put into detention, and there were some legitimate concerns about how those children were being treated. But what deeply concerns the government now about the evidence that Professor Triggs has given to this Senate estimates hearing is the revelation that there were political considerations taken into account before a decision was taken to delay an inquiry into children in detention until after the election, as well as the claims now that were originally thought not to be true, that she had spoken to Labor members, indeed Labor ministers. And so those revelations, that one, that there were political considerations about delaying the inquiry, and two, that there is now revelations that she had spoken to two senior Labor ministers, is also of great concern to the government.
But it even gets worse than that, because having spoken to those Labor ministers and delayed the inquiry till after the election, when there was a change of government, she sent a letter to the Attorney-General outlining her agenda, no mention of an inquiry into children in detention. In fact, over the ensuing months, there's no mention of this. She sends a letter about 4 to 5 months later just telling the government that there's going to be an inquiry. Her position is untenable, isn't it?
Well, there are real questions to be answered by Professor Triggs, and I'm very conscious of her esteemed reputation as an international law professor. But this evidence to the Senate inquiry does raise many, many questions, and I know it's of deep concern to the Attorney-General, George Brandis, and to the broader government. So it's going to be up to George Brandis as the responsible minister to take this forward. But there are real questions now that need to be answered.
What about the evidence itself before that committee, where she denies speaking to or advising the Labor ministers early on, then later on through, as we saw in the introduction to the program, through a few different manifestations, she eventually says, well, she did advise them, and directly, two of them, in person.
Well, as you say, there are contradictions in evidence, and they do raise other questions to be answered. But Attorney-General Brandis will take this forward, I'm sure, over time. But we need to understand why there were political considerations that were taken into account in terms of the timing of the inquiry, and secondly, why after initial denials was there now revelations that two senior ministers, Bowen and Burke, were both consulted by Professor Triggs.
Well, just finally on this, because I think the issue of children in detention itself is obviously a very, very difficult one. None of us want to see children in detention, but given that the Human Rights Commission delayed the inquiry for these so-called political reasons, and then didn't even take up the issue with the incoming government in the first few months, this is supposed to be the urgent issue of children in detention, and they're having these delays and not talking to the government about it once the government changed. No one's going to pay any attention to the Human Rights Commission's report, are they now? That'll just be completely discredited.
Well, Chris, the focus now is on getting kids out of detention, and Minister Morrison has already made a number of statements in that regard about families that can to leave detention, and we want to see the number of children in detention taken down to zero, because ultimately it does have a negative impact on those children. At the same time, we want to maintain the integrity of our border protection system, and we don't want to put any incentives there on the table for people to send their children unaccompanied on that treacherous journey all the way to Australia. So it's about getting that balance right, but certainly the first and foremost consideration for this government is about the interests of the children.
All right, I want to go to other matters with you now, and let's talk about the way the government's travelling. The Abbott government is trailing badly in the polls. In the key news poll data, there's a 10-point gap on two-party preferred, and that's been there for a number of months now, so it's not something that can be just disregarded completely, even though it's early in the electoral cycle, obviously. Now, you were up at the G20 in Brisbane last weekend. You're intimately involved with all of that. Joe Hockey and Tony Abbott were able to get Australia's agenda successfully through the G20. We've never had that many world leaders in Australia at the one time. We've seen David Cameron address the Parliament in the days before the G20, and afterwards we saw Narendra Modi and also Xi Jinping address the Australian Parliament. A free trade deal signed with China and a commitment to negotiate a free trade deal with India within a year. This is the most successful week of diplomacy we've seen on Australian shores, is it not?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, so
and you're
why,
right.
so why haven't we heard about it? Why isn't the government out there talking about it?
Well, we are talking about it, and I reject the premise of your question, Chris. I think the Prime Minister and Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey, the Treasurer, deserve a huge amount of credit for promoting this agenda. And there were a lot of concrete outcomes from the G20 summit, namely this 2% growth target over and above what would be achieved between now and 2018, about setting up the infrastructure hub in Sydney, which will allow Australia to leverage off its strengths in financing and constructing infrastructure, the agreement around better taxing of multinationals, about decisions around shadow banking, over-the-counter derivatives, and of course free trade, getting an agreement among nations to keep promoting the multilateral trading round, in addition to the successes we've had at the bilateral level with China and an agreement to pursue an FTA now with India. These are great successes. I think we need to do three things going forward, Chris. The first thing we need to do is to keep reminding Australians about our successes, because whether it was getting rid of the carbon tax, which was a $550 a year slug to Australian families, whether it was stopping the boats, which was an $11 billion blowout, whether it's the infrastructure projects like the second airport in Sydney, which has been delayed for half a century, the $2 billion worth of red tape savings, which is the number one issue.
Let me just interrupt you before you can come back to your other 2 points. But you're starting to list off some of the government's achievements here, and this is exactly my point. We hear a lot from the government's critics. Throughout the G20 weekend, there was plenty of criticism based on the Barack Obama speech. There was a lot of criticism of the free trade deal. You'll always get protectionists arguing against free trade deals, but the government hasn't been out there arguing its case. Where has the Treasurer and Prime Minister been, and other ministers, on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, wrapping all this up, explaining to the nation what this means and how they think it's going to underpin our prosperity? It seems that you're vacating the field to your critics.
Well, we're certainly not doing that, and Andrew Robb was out there this morning actually explaining the significance of this FTA with China, which every other country in the world would dream of having. We've got a two-way trade relationship of $150 billion with China. Now we'll get 95% of our products export-free into China over the coming years. I mean, think about our services sector, whether it's our universities, our aged care and our health service providers, insurance, law firms. 70% of the Australian economy is services, but only 17% of our exports are services. They will now get into China. Agriculture, we're eliminating tariffs on beef and on dairy, and we're doing so much more in terms of horticulture and other products. This is great benefits for us, and of course in the resources sector, eliminating straight away the 3% tariff on coking coal and getting the tariff on thermal coal down to zero in the next couple of years. They are real successes that our local members, Chris, will be explaining in every corner of their own electorates to every farmer, to every service provider, to every resource company, and I think that will be really important. The second thing I just wanted to say is we've got to point out and continue to point out that Labor is providing no alternative here. They keep saying that they want budget surpluses and good economic management, but where are their savings? We're getting the criticism for doing the belt-tightening in the budget. They're not doing anything.
People will focus on the opposition in an election campaign. At the moment, they want to see you govern. Now, I said at the outset here that when I wrap all this together, it's pretty obvious that this is the best week of diplomacy we've ever seen on Australian soil. You agree with that? That's a fair enough summary. I think when you look at it, nobody could argue otherwise. Yet I've heard no one from the government even make that simple observation. Is the government shy about boasting? Surely not.
Not at all. I mean, absolutely not. As you know, Chris, this is the first time ever a French president, a Brazilian president and an Italian Prime Minister have visited our country. Narendra Modi was the first Indian Prime Minister to visit Australia since Rajiv Gandhi in 1986.
Sure, but what does it all mean? What does all this mean? How's it going to affect me and my family's future?
Well, as you know, free trade creates millions of jobs in Australia. So now this free trade agreement will mean more jobs in agriculture, in services, in resources. With India, if we can capitalise on that, some of our biggest companies will be able to export their products into the Indian market. This is all about jobs, jobs, jobs for Australia. And in terms of the G20 summit, it was Australia's moment in the sun where we were able to say we're open to business, we welcome their investment in Australia, and we will get our best people, whether it's in the financing or construction of infrastructure, to go and build projects overseas. So it's all about jobs, and it is great news for Australia.
All right, Josh Frydenberg, you're a Melbourne man, a Melbourne MP, sadly a Carlton supporter. So I do want to talk to you about the state election. Dennis Napthine faces the people this Saturday. It looks like he's for the high jump. Now, he'll have a strong case in sheeting home a lot of the blame for losing government in Victoria to Tony Abbott and Canberra, won't he? Because the coalition federal government has lumbered him with a fuel excise increase, a GST debate, and now the ABC cuts broken promise. It's a hell of a burden for him to wear when he's trying to win a state election.
No, Dennis Napthine will win this election, and it will be based on state issues and the very enviable record.
He's way behind in the polls. Surely you can't confidently predict he's going to win. The expectation is he'll lose. Well,
actually, power of incumbency is one thing. It's a close-fought race. Daniel Andrews has just cozied up to the unions. He's agreed to tear up the East-West link and introduce the dark spectre of sovereign risk into Australia if he wins. This is a very clear choice, Chris, at this election. You've got economic surplus or budget surpluses under the coalition government as far as the forward estimates and further. You've actually got a AAA credit rating in Victoria, the only state in the nation to have so. You've got a $27 billion spend on infrastructure, new schools, new hospitals, and obviously major transport projects. You've got 950 PSOs, protective security officers, who are out there on every train station, and you've obviously got a much more productivity-focused, law-abiding industrial relations policy under us. 21 out of 23 Labor shadow cabinet ministers are members of the unions.
Let me stop you. You're starting to sound like a state politician there, Josh Frydenberg. Just finally then, the federal lesson here. If the Napthine government goes down, there are two, it strikes me that there will be two very strong lessons for you and your government, and that is firstly that the electorate is unhappy, the electorate is unhappy with the way things are going, and secondly that they're quite happy to decide one term is enough for a government if they're not popular. They are worrying lessons if you get them on Saturday from Victorians, aren't they?
No, look, you're right that in Victoria the last one-term government was 1955, which was the Cain Labor government. But we are very hopeful that Dennis Napthine will win on Saturday. Like I said, he's got a very good record. It's being fought on local state issues, infrastructure, law and order,
all right.
health
You don't
and
need
education.
to go through them again. Thanks very much, Josh.
They're a good record, Chris.
Thanks for
Great
joining
to be
us.
with you.
Josh Frydenberg there, the member for Kooyong in Victoria and the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister. Going to be back to talk about all of this, Gillian Triggs, cuts to the ABC, and just what's going on with the government's communications of what it's doing and why it's struggling in the polls. All of that coming up with a great panel after the break.